Hey guys, Stockaholics, thank you guys for being here today. Wanted to do an update today, talk a little bit about tankers. If we look at this market from a bird's eye view, it can look extraordinarily complex. So I kind of wanted to just break it apart and look at some of the bigger ideas that are driving the market today. And share my thoughts along the way. We're going to look at the G7 price cap now that it's kind of getting a little bit more fleshed out. I'll share my thoughts as we kind of break that apart. I wanted to look at this dark and shadow fleet that is developing. I wanted to look at some oil inventories. I wanted to look at some potential problems that could develop too. Okay, so here we go. Okay, first of all, let's take a look at the oil tanker rates. First of all, this is the Baltic Clean Tanker Index. This is your average aggregate price that a clean tanker is earning at any given time across the whole segment. And recently we passed those 2003 super cycle highs, at least in terms of nominal values. But recently we've also pulled back a little bit. However, the rates that they're earning now are still tremendously positive. The product tankers kind of led the charge across the oil tanker space. But recently we've seen that the crude tankers have also begun to catch up. The crude tankers are again earning some of those rates that we've seen not since 2003 or so. This was for the crude side. It started a lot with these smaller vessels, but eventually a lot of the larger vessels like the VLCCs caught up. Recently, I've seen some tremendous fixtures for a lot of these large vessels too. So it's pretty exciting to see all of these tremendous rates across the board. I wanted to make a quick point because I see that there's a lot of narratives out there between, clean versus dirty. A lot of people might say that they want to invest in the clean tanker segment, for example, because there are these narratives out there like diesel shortages and, we got to transfer diesel from, the northeastern United States to Europe causes dislocations in the product tanker market. I would suggest that there is not a significant difference between either the dirty or the product in the long run. This is a chart from All Things Ventured, who you should follow on Twitter if you are not. And he shows the correlation between the Baltic Dirty Tanker Index and the Baltic Clean Tanker Index. If one index moves, if one segment starts moving, it is only a matter of time before the other starts moving because there are opportunities to switch segments if one of them is earning a lot more than the other. It's not easily to do it immediately, but it can be done with enough effort, despite what a lot of these guys say. And this chart kind of shows you that is the case. Okay, so what's driving this market? First of all, there are a bunch of reasons. I want to go over some of those, maybe in importance of least important to in order of importance of least important to most important. This is a chart of the global petroleum inventories. This is the amount of stuff, crude oil and oil products being stored somewhere. This is the blue line here is 2022. Recently, over the last couple of months, there have been some builds across global inventories. However, if you look at this in terms of the average amount of storage that we've had over a long period of time, it shows you that there is a mismatch between supply and demand. A lot of narratives out there that suggest there might be some demand destruction, but if you look at a lot of these kind of things, it doesn't really show, doesn't really seem like that's the case. Okay. Now, one of the main things that have been driving this market, among others, is this thing, the US SPR. There is a lot of barrels being released from this into the oil tanker market. The reason for that, instead of a lot of that oil being released domestically in the United States, is simply because we can't refine a lot of the type of grade of oil that is being released at the rates that it is being released from the SPR. So this sweeter oil is being released from the SPR, the salt caverns. It's going on a ship, and that ship is going transported either to Europe or somewhere else, or I think seen some fixtures going to China recently with their export quotas ramping up too. A lot of people are worried about this ending. Recently, I have seen an article where someone suggests that a lot of these larger tankers that are transporting a lot of these SPR barrels will start cannibalizing some other markets. And when this SPR ends, could happen, but I think that there are some reasons why that may not happen. And I'll get into some of those in a bit as well. There's another perspective thinking about this oil demand on water. This is the global crude oil in transit. This is a post from Lars Barstad. He's the CEO of Frontline. Oil in transit continues to rise. This is ultimately tankers utilization. This is showing you that a lot of tankers are currently in business. The more tankers you get in business as you approach those very high utilization levels, where there's a lot of tankers being utilized, you start to see those very high rates like we have been seeing. Volumes are increasing like from the SPR, which he acknowledges, but he believes that it has more to do with the longer trade lanes that are opening from Russia. The ocean pipelines are just expanding. All right, to add some color to that oil on water, primarily increasing due to longer haul tanker routes. This is a slide from the recent Euronav conference call where they talk about this route in particular, where ships are being loaded in the Baltic Sea and then being taken all the way to very long haul places like India and China. These routes that you might have tankers taking oil from to Europe in a few days now take as much as I think a month to transport all the way to these faraway places. On this right hand side we have a chart of these Russian crude seaborne exports. These blue bars are the EU. You can see that those have been declining over time, and instead that oil is being transported to China, India, and to Turkey a little bit as well. There was a question on the recent conference call to Euronav from Chris Robertson that I thought was very interesting and I want to share. On slide 9, that's that slide that we were just looking at, you talk about the Russian dislocation. I just wanted to ask on the Baltic loading port, which is the one illustrated up to the north, how many of those can accommodate VLCCs? And what are there going to be ship-to-ship transfers associated with Russian crude? Hugo de Stoop, he is the CEO of Euronav. He responds, very few can accommodate these, and the ones that can, usually you cannot load to the top. So yes, there is normally, when the oil is moving far away or further away than it used to, Europe was a close destination. So these VLCCs, when they go to this port, if they cannot fill all the way in this port. I guess the port may not be deep enough to accommodate a fully laden VLCC. And so we have explained in the introductory remarks, we're talking about 3 times, 4 times, potentially 5 times the distance that we used to perform. And on that kind of, this makes sense to lighter into a VLCC. So far, we have seen a few operations doing that. So what he's talking about is some smaller ships loading at this particular port, going somewhere else, doing something called a ship-to-ship transfer, where that oil is taken off of that VLCC, put onto taken from, smaller boats, put onto a VLCC, and then VLCCs going on these longer haul routes. This trade is why I don't think that it's as likely that you see significant cannibalization from the VLCCs into the smaller segments once the SPR ends, because I think that this trade over here, based on a lot of what we've been seeing, is very likely to increase as Russian sanctions continue and escalate. So far, we have seen a few operations doing that. We expect that this will pick up dramatically in the winter. And why do we expect that to pick up dramatically? Is because in the winter, and here I'm not only talking about the Baltics, I'm much more talking about the northern part. In northern parts of Russia, you need ice-class vessels. So there's certain tankers that are designed for these ports in the wintertime. The VLCCs cannot effectively get there when these seas are frozen over. You need a specific ice-class vessel to traverse during this time. And when you look at what exists in the world, and here I'm talking a few Suezmax and then many Aframax that are ice class, I think what this is supposed to say, means that they can break the ice, they can load the oil, and then they can go to their destination. But if you use those ships to do the long voyage over that to Africa and going to India, China, and whoever is interested in taking that oil, then they won't be able to go for that distance, which is ice class. So what he's saying here is these ships that are designed for this port in the wintertime would not make sense for them to be utilized to go on these longer haul routes. So instead, they're going to go traverse this sea A lot of that oil is going to go onto these ice class vessels. They'll be transported on these short haul routes. They'll go onto VLCCs, and then those VLCCs will go to much further away destinations. There are also some things that we're going to see in a second where these sanctions are likely to further reinforce these really long haul routes that are developing. Okay, now one more point. It's not just that these Russian oil barrels are going much further away. It's also that the EU still has an energy demand that needs to be satisfied in order for them to, exist and hopefully prosper. So instead of this oil being transported right next door, instead it's coming from much further away places like the Atlantic and the Gulf. So vice versa. Although there's oil going further away from Russia, there's also oil coming further away to Europe. There's also this problem with natural gas in Europe. Recently, I think a lot of these fears have, toned down a little bit because a lot of the storage has been filled in the Europe. But I would like to remind people that, if storage is one thing, but if you are going to have a successful economy in the long run, you need energy. So yes, these inventories are full, but the economic consequences of a lack of energy in Europe are, I think, just beginning to hit the surface, right? And so one of the things that we are likely to see, because there is no longer gas flows going to Europe, you will probably see, to some extent, you will see some oil being used instead, as wherever it can be, as a substitute. I know, for example, in Germany, they've created some of these electricities. This is a few months ago I saw, where they're burning electricity on these small platforms in the water. Or sorry, they were burning oil to create electricity. There's also some industrial uses where these industrial plants in Europe needs energy, and they can substitute that using oil. So in the long run, it seems likely that the demand for oil, although the natural gas problem through the winter has been solved, the likelihood that the demand for oil we see to the EU is likely to continue to increase because of this substitution. And again, a lot of that oil is going to be coming from most likely these longer haul routes instead of Russia as well. Okay, recently we have seen the plans for the G7 Russian oil price cap. Their plans, their interesting idea has been finalized. So this is an article from the Zero Hedge. Russian oil price cap will not apply to resold cargoes. The United States and its Western allies have agreed that a cargo of Russian oil will only be subject to the price cap mechanism at the first sale of the oil to a buyer on land. Sources familiar with ongoing discussions told the Wall Street Journal. This means that the upcoming price cap will not apply to the resale of the same Russian cargo. The price cap will not apply to a cargo of Russian crude processed into gasoline when the gasoline is sold either. Now, my understanding is what this means is if Russian oil is sold under the price cap to a G7 or any other country, a G7 country will not repurchase that oil if it is transported by sea both ways. So for example, that long haul route that goes from northern the Baltic Sea all the way to India, if that oil was bought by the Indians at $60, let's say that is the price cap that they decide on, and the current price of oil is somewhere around $90. If that oil is going by sea, the G7 will not buy it. But if that oil is bought on land and is instead transported via pipeline, then wherever that pipeline is established, that country can capture that $30 spread that we talked about. So it doesn't apply to sea crude exports that go from point A to point B to point C on water, but it does apply if it goes from point A to point B on water and it goes from point B to C on land. So you can resell crude if it goes from tanker through pipeline to capture that spread. On the flip side, the Russian price cap the G7 will, however, buy products if they are refined. So if you buy Russian crude oil somewhere, and for example, if the Russians sold it to China, and China has a lot of refining export capacity, for example, if they bought that $60 oil, from Russia is transported by sea, they refined it into diesel or gasoline. The G7 will buy that refined product by sea. You cannot make this stuff up. Okay, or understand it either. However, intermediary sales and trades of Russian oil happening at sea should be subject to the price cap, according to journal sources. The US and the G7 allies and Australia are working on setting the details of the price cap before the December 5th deadline, after which the EU embargo on imports of Russian crude oil by sea enters force. Okay. Basically, the way you can summarize this is there's a lot of inefficiencies being added to the market. In addition to the ship-to-ship transfers that are probably going to develop, in addition to the longer haul routes, this is not going to stop Russian oil from escaping Russia. Now, likewise, Russia is very incentivized to get, this is a point I haven't made, by the way, they are incentivized to get a lot of this oil out. They do not have a lot of on-land storage that can just keep all of that oil that they used to pump from Russia to the EU. And they can't really stop this oil flow, or they don't want to anyway, and shut in this wells, because if they do, it's unlikely that they'll be able to get those wells flowing once again, especially after you go through these really cold winters in a lot of these places where the Russian oil is being pumped. So because they can't store it, and because they can't really shut in these wells, they're highly incentivized to get a lot of this on water. Now, we'll see what happens, but I mean, I've seen people that are bearish. I've seen people that are nervous about what's going to happen. I really don't see how this turns out in any other way than increasing oil on water and even more inefficiencies developing as we go on. One last thing I wanted to talk about in this video, a trend that we are seeing increasing, is this sanctioned illicit dark fleet. Goes by all kinds of those kind of names. This fleet is a bunch of vessels that are involved in sanctioned oil trade. So countries like Iran, Venezuela, and now increasingly Russia, especially as we go post December 5th, are involved in this trade. This is a post from Michelle Ruiz Bachman, who you should be following on Twitter if you are not. An accident waiting to happen. 43 tankers, including 29 VLCCs and anchors in international waters off Southeast Malaysia, engaged in floating storage ship-to-ship transfers for Iran, Venezuela, and now Russian oil, all part of the dark fleet that's evolved to ship sanctioned crude oil to China. So as long as you have a buyer that is willing to buy sanctioned oil, you are unlikely, in my opinion, it's unlikely for these sanctions to be very effective. If it wasn't for Iran and Venezuela, I have a hard time believing that it will be for Russia either. Now, I wanted to also make a point of this because I've heard some interesting ideas developing, where there's an idea that you could see an undercapacity in this shadow fleet to deliver this sanctioned oil on these longer haul routes, especially post December 5th, when those sanctions go fully into place. And you might also see an overcapacity on the legitimate side of the trade develop, right? If legitimate tankers in these that are willing to abide by these G7 sanctions, or if they can't really get insurance to get involved in that trade, potentially the ton miles and the amount of oil for them specifically could go down, whereas for tankers like this involved in this illicit trade could go up. And I would like to make a point that I think that this is a possibility, but I don't think that it is a long-term thing that's going to hamper the overall oil tanker market. And the reason I think that is because of that point that I made earlier in the video involving arbitrage opportunities, right? So as long as there are differences between the crude and product segments, for example, if there's a dislocation there between rates, those dislocations get filled over time. We saw that from this post here from All Things Ventured, right? I would suggest that if there is a big dislocation between, where was it now? The illicit trade and the clean trade, you will see increasing amounts of sales, I believe, from this legitimate fleet into this sanctioned fleet. I think what this is really showing us, though, and is that there is kind of this bifurcation taking place in the world, and it's a trend that I think that should be followed closer, not only for tankers but for other investment ideas too. Now, one of the ways that but you see that this is taking place is through something called undisclosed buyers, I guess is they're called. You see a lot of these old tonnage being sold that might otherwise, some of those might otherwise have gone to scrap, instead going to this fleet. Okay, now hopefully I didn't go too far off tangent or to strange places in this video. Let me know in the comments below. So far, I would say I've looked at a lot of bearish things out there on the tankers, and I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit too close to the space, but I'm still very bullish. Although there's some reasons to be bearish, I still think that the overall market has a long way to go. I have not sold any of my tankers on net as of yet. I have sold some companies, a lot of those product tankers that have been high flying to kind of buy some other companies. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below on the price caps, the sanctions, the illicit trade, or anything else in tankers. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts or questions. Let me know. Have a great weekend.